General Hospital will reveal after being cast out of deception in a storm of humiliation and outrage, Natalia didn't just lose her job, she lost her identity, her dignity, and the fragile trust she had carefully built over the years in Port Charles. This wasn't just a professional setback, it was a harsh indictment of everything she had believed in: loyalty, talent, and connection. Whispers of her fall from grace spread like wildfire through the elite circles of the town, silent knives cutting into her pride with every glance and murmured conversation. People who once smiled at her during glamorous soirees, who toasted to her small victories, now turned away in quiet disdain, treating her as a stain to be avoided. Natalia had believed that tireless effort and the right alliances would see her through any storm. She had always thought of herself as a fighter, at least that's what she told herself each morning in the mirror. And in that battle, she had once thought her army was strong. Colleagues like Brooke Lynn, Lucy, Maxie, and her former lover, Sidwell, whom she trusted, still held respect for her. But all of that dissolved into ash when the truth of their past relationship surfaced, sparking a wave of condemnation and dismissal from those who once called her friend. Not one voice rose in her defense, not a single word of sympathy, not a single lingering look of compassion. She was discarded, treated as disposable over a private matter she never thought would matter. In the burning pit of her fury, Natalia aimed her resentment toward the women who had turned their backs on her. Brooke Lynn, who had leaned on her to escape family pressure. Lucy, who had preached forgiveness and trust. Maxie, who had once laughed with her during tense meetings. But the most bitter betrayal came from Sidwell, the man she once loved, the one she thought would at least protect her memory. Instead, he let the secret explode, causing a ripple that destroyed everything she had. He didn't just cost her a job, he cost her her reputation, her dignity, and every remaining thread of fragile connection she had left. But the person she despised most, deeply, irrevocably, was Sonny. To her, his silence was the sharpest blow, colder and more calculated than any act of sabotage. She had once believed in him, revered him even. He was power incarnate in Port Charles. A man who could shift destinies with a single nod. Natalia had risked everything to win his trust. She kept secrets, brokered backroom deals, and even took on roles in shady operations she wished she could forget. All with the belief that if the time came, Sonny would be there for her. That moment did come, and Sonny didn't just turn away. He disappeared. No message. No comfort. Not even a hint of acknowledgement. Natalia was abandoned, and the silence was deafening. His apathy hit her like a blade, slicing through what little self-worth she had left. She was crushed not just by the loss, but by the realization that the one person she had counted on had never truly stood by her side. The betrayal didn't just throw Natalia off course, it made her question everything about herself. She was no longer the bold, accomplished woman Port Charles once respected. She had become a shadow, drifting through her days, haunted by unanswered questions, tormented by the thought that maybe she had trusted the wrong people. Every night, alone in her dim apartment, Natalia sat for hours by the window, staring into the dark, wondering, if she could go back, would she choose differently? But the cruelest truth was this: there was no going back. Everything she had, her career, her love, her reputation, was gone. And the woman who once stood so tall now existed only as a shattered soul, quietly facing a grim reality. She had been betrayed, discarded, and left with no one left to believe in. In the days that followed her expulsion from deception, Natalia was no longer the confident, radiant woman who once commanded attention in every room she entered. She withdrew into silence, retreating from the world she once ruled with poise and precision. The light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a haunting emptiness. Her steps lost their rhythm, her once flawless appearance gave way to quiet disarray. But beneath that fragile, distant exterior, her mind was sharpening like a blade in the dark. Natalia wasn't broken, she was strategizing. She began to live a life shrouded in shadows. No longer attending social events, no longer answering calls, Natalia severed nearly every tie to the outside world. But rather than wallowing in despair, she turned her solitude into a weapon. She wasn't crying or begging anyone to help her reclaim what had been taken, she was gathering intel. Natalia had decided that if the world had turned against her, she would make it pay. Quietly, obsessively, she began investigating Sidwell, digging deep into the illegal dealings he had hidden beneath layers of deception and corporate gloss. She wasn't naive, she knew this was a deadly game, and that Sidwell wasn't just influential, he was dangerous. But Natalia had already lost too much to turn back now. Every day, she became more entrenched in her mission. She pored over old contracts, reread suspicious emails, revisited financial reports she once skimmed without a second thought. Every tiny detail that might expose Sidwell's corruption became a clue. She hired private investigators under aliases, tracked down former associates silenced by threats or payoffs, and even infiltrated confidential meetings by posing as an anonymous insider. Bit by bit, she was assembling a dangerous portrait of Sidwell's empire, one he had carefully concealed for years. Natalia knew the risks. Sidwell wasn't just a corrupt businessman. He was entrenched in the underworld, backed by people who could make anyone disappear. Others who had tried to cross him ended up ruined or worse, erased without a trace. But Natalia no longer feared the consequences. Her name had already been dragged through the mud. Her reputation had been destroyed. Her relationship severed. And worst of all, she had lost the version of herself she once believed in. All that remained was an unyielding will to fight back. If she couldn't reclaim her old life, she would at least go out as someone who didn't go quietly. She began building a secret dossier, compiling every shred of evidence she could find, forged documents, suspicious transactions, financial statements altered to cover illegal activities. She knew that even one piece of the puzzle exposed could bring Sidwell's empire crashing down. But she also understood that the moment he caught wind of her actions, she would become a target. And he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate her. Living in constant paranoia, Natalia changed her routines, avoided patterns, and never took the same route twice. Every phone call felt like a threat. Every creak of the floorboards at night sent her pulse racing. But the fear didn't stop her. Instead, it fueled her. She began recording phone calls, planting tracking devices during meetings, and storing her evidence in multiple secure locations. She wasn't just trying to protect herself, she was making sure that if something happened to her, the truth would still survive. Gone was the woman who once walked proudly through deception's gleaming corridors. In her place was a shadow, a silent warrior fighting a private war. Natalia had become someone the old Port Charles society would never recognize. But in the ruins of who she used to be, a new identity emerged, one forged in betrayal, honed in pain, and driven by a relentless thirst for justice. And in the shattered remains of her soul, one fragile flame still flickered. The hope that if she succeeded, no one else would have to suffer as she did. And then, as thunder rolled through the skies over Port Charles and rain fell in relentless sheets, the city awoke to a chilling whisper that spread like poison on the wind: Natalia was dead. The news did not come as a formal report. There was no press release, no official confirmation in the early hours. It arrived in murmurs, in gasps, in trembling hands scrolling through anonymous tips and whispered messages. By dawn, it was no longer a rumor, it was a fact. Natalia had been found lifeless in a shadow-choked alleyway not far from the warehouse district, a place known for its silence and secrets. Her body, battered and broken, was discovered by a janitor from a nearby bar, who immediately called authorities but could barely utter a word beyond the scream that tore through the night. What they found was more gruesome than anyone expected. Natalia's face was nearly unrecognizable, her body marred by vicious blows and signs of a violent struggle. The rain had washed away most of the blood, but not all. Dark stains marked the pavement in jagged patterns, like silent echoes of her final moments. There were no security cameras in the area. No witnesses came forward. Her phone was gone, and the contents of her purse had been scattered but not stolen. Nothing pointed to a robbery. This was no random act. It was deliberate. It was personal. News of her death swept across Port Charles in waves of disbelief and horror. At Deception, whispers filled the halls like ghosts. Some stood in stunned silence, others wept behind closed doors. A few exchanged nervous glances, unable to forget how recently Natalia had confronted them, how fiercely she had fought back. Her enemies were not few, and her departure from the company had been anything but graceful. But even so, no one had truly believed it would come to this. A few miles away, Sidwell reportedly cancelled all meetings that day, his office locked from the inside. He issued no public statement. He didn't attend a press conference hastily arranged by Deception to address recent developments. Speculation ignited like wildfire. Had Sidwell discovered the depth of Natalia's investigation? Had she finally gotten too close to the truth and paid the ultimate price? Or was this the work of someone else entirely, one of the women she had threatened to expose, someone who saw in Natalia not a wronged woman but a ticking time bomb? And then, inevitably, the name Sonny entered the conversation. Quietly at first, then louder, bolder. Everyone in Port Charles knew what Sonny was capable of. They knew the stories, the quiet disappearances, the enemies who simply stopped being. And they knew the one rule you could never break: don't betray Sonny. Natalia had broken that rule, some whispered. Maybe not with intent, but betrayal in Sonny's world didn't need a motive, it only needed consequence. The police issued a brief, sterile statement about an ongoing investigation. No suspects. No leads. No cause of death officially released, though the bruises on her body told a story of agony. The local hospital confirmed she hadn't been treated anywhere nearby. The coroner's report would later cite blunt force trauma, but little else. As the days passed, the official silence became deafening. Her funeral, hastily arranged by a distant cousin who flew in from New York, was a quiet, somber affair. Fewer than a dozen people attended. There were no flowers from former colleagues, no eulogies from friends. Just the low murmur of the priest, the rain drumming against the canopy, and a closed casket that left more to the imagination than most were comfortable with. Behind closed doors, people began to talk. They talked about how Natalia had changed in her final weeks. How she had grown paranoid, withdrawn, obsessed. They talked about her feud with Deception, her rage at Sidwell, her disappointment with Sonny. They talked about her refusal to give up, even when it became clear she was pushing against forces far more powerful than she could ever hope to defeat. And they talked, quietly but insistently, about the idea that maybe she had brought this upon herself. Natalia went too far, some would say, sipping coffee in dimly lit diners. She didn't know when to stop. Others were less forgiving. She was warned. You don't cross Sonny and live to tell about it. And still, a few dared to mourn her without judgment, remembering the woman she had once been, the fierce advocate, the dazzling businesswoman, the loyal friend before the world turned on her. But even those voices were soft, almost guilty, as if grieving her was itself an act of rebellion. In the end, Natalia became a cautionary tale. Her name joined the long, whispered list of those who had vanished or died mysteriously after daring to poke the beasts that ruled Port Charles. She was no longer remembered for her work, her charm, or her wit. She was remembered for her fall, for her final, fatal move on a board stacked against her. In the grand game of power, she had dared to act like a queen. But in the eyes of the men who really ran the game, she was just another pawn. A sacrifice. An example. And so, beneath the gray skies of Port Charles, Natalia's story ended not with justice, not with redemption, but with silence. A brutal, unanswered silence that hung over the city like fog, thick with everything left unsaid. On the day of Natalia's funeral, Port Charles felt heavier than usual, as if the sky itself mourned in silence. The clouds loomed low and gray, casting a cold, melancholic veil over the modest cemetery nestled on the outskirts of town. There was no procession. No choir. No flowers. No heartfelt tributes written in shaking hands. Only a plain black hearse that arrived quietly, and a small gathering of no more than a dozen people, most of whom barely knew the woman whose body lay within the coffin. There was no crowd of mourners dressed in black designer dresses or finely tailored suits, no echoes of the glamorous soirees where Natalia had once reigned as a social centerpiece. The polished casket rested beneath a flimsy canopy, unattended by the people who had once filled her life with business meetings, celebratory champagne toasts, and carefully calculated conversations. Not a single colleague from Deception attended. None of the socialites who once toasted to her presence. Even the man whose influence she had once defended with loyalty, Sonny, was nowhere to be found. The priest's voice trembled slightly as he read a generic passage from the Book of Psalms, more out of duty than affection. There were no personal anecdotes, no laughter through tears, no one stepping forward to share a memory or even call her name aloud. A few distant relatives stood in the back, their faces unreadable. One woman clutched a worn umbrella, staring at the casket with a look of vacant detachment, as though unsure if she even belonged there. Two strangers from the local shelter, where Natalia had once briefly volunteered during her early years in town, showed up out of respect, not knowing the details of her death but feeling that no one should be buried without witnesses. A man in a dark trench coat lingered at a distance by a tree, face obscured by the shadow of his hat, never stepping closer than necessary. Even in death, Natalia remained isolated, estranged not just from life but from the legacy she had so desperately tried to protect. The emptiness around her grave wasn't merely physical, it was a statement. A reflection of how thoroughly she had been erased from the social tapestry she once fought so hard to weave herself into. The silence was oppressive, but it spoke louder than any sermon. It told the unspoken truth everyone knew but no one dared admit: Natalia had been betrayed, discarded, destroyed by the very hand she had once trusted. And in that suffocating silence, a deeper, darker acknowledgement took root. People who had turned their backs on her now kept their distance not out of grief, but fear. Fear of what her death represented. Fear of becoming the next cautionary tale. Because if Natalia, a woman who was once elegant, calculating, and connected, could fall so swiftly and violently, what chance did anyone else have? There were those who believed she had brought her fate upon herself, that she had flown too close to the sun. But even those voices were quiet now, drowned beneath the weight of what her end truly symbolized. Natalia had become a ghost long before she was lowered into the earth. A whispered name. A lesson. A reminder. In life, she had dared to challenge powers greater than herself. In death, she became a monument to what happened when someone underestimated just how far those powers would go to maintain control. Her body was returned to the soil without protest, without defense, as if Port Charles itself was eager to bury the evidence of its own complicity. And yet, even in silence, Natalia's story lingered. She became the unspoken warning on everyone's lips. In smoky backrooms and dimly lit corridors, her name was dropped in hushed tones whenever someone suggested pushing back, questioning authority, or taking a stand. "Don't forget what happened to Natalia," they would mutter, not out of empathy, but calculation. She had tried to hold the powerful accountable, and for that, she had paid the price. The warning was clear, etched not on a plaque or marble stone, but in the minds of everyone who bore witness to her rise and fall: never turn your back on Sonny. Never challenge the order of things. And most of all, never mistake proximity to power as protection from its wrath. Because in Port Charles, loyalty is currency, betrayal is death, and Natalia was the tax paid for forgetting the rules.